rain came down in sheets that night, relentless as if the sky itself wanted to drown the earth. It was one of those storms that didn't simply visit and pass, it settled in, digging its claws into the hours, stretching time into something sluggish and oppressive. Inside his tiny cabin on the edge of Black Hollow Forest, Daniel tightened the shutters and checked the oil lamp. He'd lived in the woods for nearly a decade, but he had never heard the rain sound like this. It wasn't just water striking wood and soil. It was rhythmic, almost patterned, like a knocking. The arrival of the storm. Daniel had always been a solitary man. After the city chewed him up with debt, betrayals, and heartbreak, he sought out silence, preferring the company of trees to people. The cabin had been his salvation. Rough-hewn logs, a leaking roof, and a single-room stove. But it was his kingdom. That night, however, silence refused him. Each gust of wind rattled the windows, and every downpour carried with it whispers, not of rain, but of voices carried on it. At first he told himself it was the storm playing tricks on tired ears. But when he paused, holding his breath, the whispering grew clearer. Someone was calling his name. The knock at the door. It was near midnight when it happened. A single deliberate knock. Not thunder, not a falling branch. Knock. Daniel froze. No one ever visited this deep into the forest. The nearest town was a 20-mile drive, and the road had long since washed out. With hesitation, he reached for his lantern and crept toward the door. His heartbeat seemed louder than the storm. "Who's there?" he called. Silence, only the sound of rain. He nearly convinced himself it was his imagination, until the knock came again, louder, insistent. Daniel yanked open the door. The lantern's glow stretched outward, fighting against the storm. No one. But the muddy ground bore footprints, bare human footprints, leading from the blackened tree line straight to his cabin. And then, they stopped. Right at the threshold. The stranger in the rain. The third knock came not from the door, but from the window. Daniel spun, the lantern swinging wildly. Pressed against the glass was a pale face. Eyes wide and unblinking, skin stretched thin as paper. Water streamed down its features, yet its lips didn't move. He stumbled back, the lantern almost dropping from his hand. The window pane rattled. Then, just as suddenly, the face was gone. Daniel's chest tightened. He tried to laugh, to shake it off as stress and weather. But the footprints outside still lingered, filling with rainwater. And though he tried to convince himself otherwise, he was certain they hadn't been there an hour ago. The phone call. In desperation, Daniel picked up the old rotary phone that connected to the ranger's outpost. To his relief, the line still worked. He could hear the dial tone under the storm. He spun the number. The line clicked, then buzzed. Finally, a voice answered, but it wasn't the ranger. It was his own. "Daniel," the voice rasped, distorted but undeniably his. "Don't let it in." The phone went dead. The shadows inside Daniel backed away, pulse hammering. His mind scrambled for logic. Faulty lines, hallucinations, stress. But deep down, instinct gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. Something had entered with the storm. The cabin suddenly felt wrong. Shadows bled thicker in the corners, where the lantern's light faltered. The rain's rhythm grew slower, more deliberate, like a drumbeat marking time. And then he saw it, a wet handprint, on the inside wall. The shape was too long, the fingers stretched unnaturally. Drip by drip, water trickled down the wood, though the hand itself was no longer there. The doppelganger. When Daniel turned, his breath froze. Standing in the doorway to the bedroom was himself, but twisted, gaunt, drenched, eyes too wide, smile too sharp, like a reflection warped through water. The doppelganger tilted its head, rain still streaming from its hair onto the floorboards. Its lips parted, but no words came, only the sound of knocking, from somewhere deep within its chest. Daniel staggered backward, reaching for the iron poker by the stove. His double stepped closer, each movement jerky, unnatural. When it finally spoke, the voice was wet, gurgling, as though it had drowned long ago. "Let me back in, Daniel." The flight into the storm. Daniel didn't wait to hear more. He lunged for the door, ripping it open, and fled into the downpour. The storm swallowed him whole, rain stinging his skin, mud sucking at his boots. He didn't care where he went, so long as it was away. Behind him, the cabin groaned as though it were alive, its wood splintering, its windows shattering under invisible pressure. Over the wind, he heard his double laugh, a horrible sound, like his own voice tearing apart. The forest loomed, branches clawing, but he pressed forward. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in blinding flashes. That's when he realized he was no longer alone. Figures stood between the trees, dozens of them, all pale, all dripping with rain, all with his face. The endless night. Daniel's scream was lost to the thunder. He ran, but no matter how far his legs carried him, the forest never changed. The same twisted oak, the same fallen log, the same patch of mushrooms appeared again and again. The rain never let up. The night never ended. His breath burned, his legs gave way, but he kept moving, because whenever he stopped, the figures grew closer, 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 and always knocking. The final knock. Days or minutes, time had no meaning. Later, Daniel collapsed. Mud covered him, rain poured into his lungs, but still he dragged himself forward. Ahead, through the curtain of rain, he saw something, a warm light, another cabin, salvation. With the last of his strength, he crawled to the door and pounded against it, over and over. "Please, let me in. For God's sake, let me in." Inside, footsteps approached. A man's shadow moved behind the window. The door creaked open, and Daniel found himself staring into his own terrified face. From inside, his voice called out, "Who's there?" The door slammed shut. The storm continued, and Daniel realized he had become the knocking at the door. The rain had started at dusk, quiet at first, just a gentle patter against the glass of Evelyn's farmhouse window. By midnight, it had grown into a torrent, hammering the roof like nails being driven into wood. She told herself it was nothing unusual. Autumn storms were common here, especially in the valley. But as she sat alone in the darkened living room, a single candle sputtering against the draft, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening. It began with the radio. The first broadcast. The old shortwave set had belonged to her grandfather, a relic that barely worked anymore. Static usually filled the channels, broken only by the occasional fragment of some distant station. But as the storm thickened, the static shifted. Through the hiss, a voice emerged. "Evelyn." She froze. It wasn't possible. The radio wasn't connected to anything but the storm's electric charge. "Don't go outside." The voice was flat, monotone, but it carried her name with unnerving precision. Evelyn reached out and twisted the knob sharply, killing the noise. Silence returned, except for the rain, drumming its endless rhythm. But now the silence felt worse. The power goes out. At 12:17 a.m., the lights died. The farmhouse plunged into blackness, broken only by the weak glow of her candle. Evelyn muttered a curse. The generator in the barn should have kicked on, but the storm must have killed it. Gathering her courage, she pulled on her raincoat and boots. The barn was only 100 yards away. She could sprint it. The moment she opened the door, the storm greeted her like a wall of needles. Wind shrieked through the trees, bending them like claws. She shielded her candle with a cupped hand, but it guttered and died within seconds. The darkness outside wasn't natural. It was thick, almost oily, swallowing the shapes of fences and sheds. And yet, she swore she saw something standing in the rain. Not a person. Taller. Bent at an angle no body could bend. Watching her. The barn Evelyn ran. Mud sucked at her boots. Rain blinded her, but she didn't dare slow down. She yanked the barn door open and slipped inside, slamming it shut against the howling wind. Inside, the familiar smell of hay and rust greeted her, but the comfort didn't last. The generator sat at the far end, silent. She grabbed the pull cord and tugged hard. The machine sputtered, died. She tugged again. From the shadows above, something answered. Not with a sputter, with a laugh. The thing on the rafters. Evelyn's eyes darted upward for a split second, illuminated by a jagged streak of lightning. She saw it. A figure crouched in the rafters, limbs too long, head cocked at a grotesque tilt, water dripping endlessly from its skin, its mouth stretched wide, teeth reflecting the lightning. And then it was gone, vanishing back into the dark. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She staggered toward the generator, pulling at the cord again and again, desperate for light. But before it could catch, something whispered right into her ear, though no one was near enough to whisper. "Don't go outside." It was the radio voice. The house changed. Evelyn fled the barn. She didn't care if the storm ripped her apart. Anything was better than what lingered in the shadows above. She stumbled back into the house, drenched and trembling. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she was safe again, until she noticed the layout was wrong. The hall stretched longer than it ever had, impossibly so. The pictures on the walls weren't hers anymore. They showed unfamiliar faces, pale and expressionless, staring directly at her. And down the hallway, a door she had never seen before stood slightly ajar. Rain hissed from the crack beneath it. The broadcast returns. The radio snapped on by itself. Static filled the house, bouncing off the warped walls. Then, clearly, they're in the house now. Evelyn's breath hitched. She grabbed a fireplace poker, her only weapon, and crept toward the new door. The rain leaking from beneath it smelled of rot. As she pushed it open, the static roared louder, swallowing everything. The room beyond wasn't a room at all. It was outside, a forest dripping with rain, and standing among the trees were figures, dozens of them, limbs bent, faces hidden, all turned toward her. The visitor's one stepped forward. Its skin glistened like wet parchment, stretched too thin over bone. Its jaw hung loose, swinging slightly as though unhinged. When it spoke, its voice was the same as the radio's. "Evelyn, you shouldn't have opened the door." She stumbled back, slamming the door shut. But the moment she did, the windows rattled violently, as though dozens of fists were pounding against them in unison. Rain poured through cracks in the glass, running in streaks along the walls. She turned to run, only to find the hallway was gone. Now there was only the forest. The forest inside Evelyn's farmhouse had melted away. Around her, towering trees loomed, their branches sagging with rain. The figures stepped between them, circling closer. Their movements were jerky like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. She screamed at them to stay back, brandishing the poker wildly. But then the radio voice whispered again, louder now, filling the entire forest. "You let us in, Evelyn. Now we'll never leave." The figures closed in. Their faces slid into clarity. Each one of them was her. The final signal. Dozens of Evelyns stared at her, each pale, waterlogged, mouths opening in perfect unison. From their throats came a sound, not human, but the grinding hiss of radio static. It grew louder, vibrating the very ground beneath her feet until she thought her head would split. She dropped the poker, hands clamping over her ears, but it didn't matter. The static was inside her skull. The last thing she saw before the world dissolved into rain was her own face, leaning close, lips stretching wide, whispering, "Don't go outside." Aftermath. 2 weeks later, a search party found Evelyn's farmhouse. The generator was intact. The furniture was undisturbed. The only strange detail was the radio. It was still on. Through the static, the rescuers swore they heard a woman's voice, faint and broken, repeating the same words again and again. "Help me. Don't go outside. Help me." The rain started again that night, and none of them slept. The rain began before sundown, a fine mist drifting down from the mountains, clinging to the air like cobwebs. By nightfall, it had thickened into sheets, drumming against the windows of the roadside inn where Mira worked. The inn was small, a forgotten stop on an old highway that hardly anyone traveled anymore. Most nights were quiet, an occasional trucker, a stranded tourist, but nothing more. Tonight, however, the inn felt different. The storm had cut off the power an hour ago, leaving only oil lamps to cast their flickering light. Shadows crawled across the walls, lengthening with each gust of wind. Mira sat behind the counter, listening, not just to the rain, but to the silence beneath it. And then she heard the knock. The stranger's arrival. It wasn't the polite tap of a guest. It was deliberate, heavy. 3 knocks, slow and spaced, as if whoever stood outside wasn't asking to be let in. They were announcing themselves. Mira's stomach tightened. Still, she did her job. She pulled on her sweater, lifted a lantern, and opened the door. The rain blew in instantly, cold and sharp. Standing at the threshold was a man in a long black coat, water pouring off him in rivulets. His face was pale, hair plastered to his skin, but his eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the lantern like an animal's. "I need a room," he said, his voice too calm for someone drenched to the bone. Mira hesitated but nodded. The storm was brutal. She couldn't turn him away. She handed him a key and gestured down the hallway. He didn't thank her. He didn't smile. He simply walked past, boots leaving wet prints on the old floorboards. She watched him until he disappeared into room 6. Only then did she notice. His footsteps hadn't made a sound. The lantern's glow. The inn felt colder after he arrived. Mira tried to shake it off. She lit another lantern and made her nightly rounds, checking the locks on the side doors, making sure the storm hadn't pried open a window. But every time she passed room 6, she paused. The crack beneath the door glowed faintly, not yellow like lamplight, but pale blue. And from within came the sound of whispering. Not one voice, but many, layered atop each other, speaking too quickly to understand. She pressed her ear closer. All at once, the voices stopped, and in the silence, a single whisper hissed right into her ear, though the door never opened. Mira. The story of the lantern. Shaken, she retreated to the lobby. On the shelf behind the counter sat an old book of local folklore, left behind years ago by a traveler. She flipped through it by lantern light, hoping to distract herself. Her hand stilled when she found a page marked by water stains. It told of a spirit said to wander during storms. The lantern bearer. According to the tale, it appeared as a drenched traveler, carrying a lantern that glowed blue. It would ask for shelter, and those who let it in would be found days later, drowned, not in water but in air, lungs filled with rain as though the storm had entered their bodies. Mira's pulse raced. She glanced toward the hallway. Room 6 still glowed faintly beneath the door. The second knock at 1 a.m., the knocking came again. But this time it wasn't at the front door. It was at every door. Room to room, door to door, a slow, thunderous knock, as though something walked the hallway, testing each threshold. Mira held her breath, lantern trembling in her hands. She listened as it moved closer, closer, until finally, it stopped at the lobby door behind her. 3 knocks, heavy, final. Her lantern sputtered, nearly going out. She didn't turn around. The guests. The inn should have been empty save for the stranger, but when Mira finally dared to move, she found wet footprints in the lobby. Not just one set, dozens. They trailed across the floor, leading to the staircase, up into the rooms above. Heart hammering, she crept up the stairs. The hallway was alive with sound. Behind every closed door, she heard breathing. Wet, labored, ragged breathing. She stepped carefully, lantern light stretching down the corridor. The first door swung open on its own. Inside, a woman stood facing the corner, her back to Mira. Her clothes dripped with rain, though the floor around her was bone dry. Slowly the woman turned. Her face was blank, skin pale as paper, and in her hand she held a lantern glowing faint blue. Mira stumbled back. Every door in the hallway opened at once, and within each stood a figure, silent, dripping, each holding the same lantern. The return to room 6. Mira fled down the stairs, nearly dropping her light. She ran to room 6, desperate for answers, or maybe to end it. The glow beneath the door had grown brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. She shoved it open. The room was empty. No man, no belongings. Only a single lantern resting on the bed, burning with blue fire that gave off no heat. The whispers returned, rushing around her in a whirlwind. She clamped her hands over her ears, but they weren't coming from outside. They were inside her skull, dozens of voices chanting in rhythm with the storm. She staggered back into the hall. The guests were waiting. The flood. As the figures advanced, the inn began to change. Water poured from the ceilings, seeping from the walls, flooding the floors. Mira gasped for breath as icy rain filled the hallway, rising to her knees, then her waist. The lanterns burned steadily, unaffected. The pale figures waited closer, their whispers turning to one voice, unified, inescapable. "Join us." She fought her way toward the lobby, lungs burning. But when she reached the front door, it was gone. Only another hallway stretched before her, filled with water and endless doors, each one glowing blue. The last guest. When they found the inn days later, the storm had passed. The power lines were down, the place abandoned. Not a single window was broken, not a single lock forced. But the floors were soaked, waterlogged as though submerged for weeks, and on the front desk sat a lantern glowing faintly blue. The police never found Mira, but travelers on that highway whisper of her still. They say on nights when the rain won't stop, you can see her lantern glowing in the inn's window. Sometimes, if you listen closely, you'll hear her voice beneath the storm, knocking, asking to be let in.